I really am thrilled to be here at Stanford. It's just so exciting to be back with a large community. Working as an artist, I work with teams a lot, but I pretty much work, on my own, not in a broad research community. So, there's a community of artists, but it's not who I was engaging with on a day-to-day basis. So it's really fun to be back here. I was saying at lunch, it's interesting for me also to think about giving a talk like this as to what issues would be of interest to you guys. I really am operating largely in the fine art community, so we like to talk about, certain kinds of conceptual things. But design has always played a really important role in my work because I am making installations that engage with people. So I'm going to try to focus a little bit on the actual interaction design of the works that I'm doing. And the first one, like Oni said, that I'd like to show you is TextTrain. I created this with a fellow master's student at the NYU Interactive Telecommunications program, which is where I was doing my degree. I guess I should say a little about my background. My undergrad degree was in fine art, but I almost double majored in environmental science, so I was always interested in systems and how the parameters of a system interacted. And when I saw kind of early CD-ROMs, this ancient technology, which most of you probably haven't dealt with, interactive CD-ROMs. This is kind of also in the dawn of the internet, when you couldn't really put images and movies online yet. The ability to craft a space that, like this metaphorical space that people could navigate through, that was the words we used at the time, by choosing their path of how they clicked on different icons or worked with different imagery in that CD-ROM space is what got me interested in programming. So I started learning how to program and eventually went back to this program where I eventually, as my thesis project, and then also continuing on as a researcher at Interval Research, they sponsored me after I graduated. These were the kind of projects I was doing. So I'm going to play a little video.
TextTrain is a playful interactive installation that blurs the boundary between the familiar and the magical. Participants in the TextTrain installation use the familiar instrument of their bodies to lift and play with falling letters that do not really exist. Like rain or snow, the colored text can be caught, lifted, and then let fall again. If a participant accumulates enough letters along their outstretched arms, they can sometimes catch a word or even a phrase.
Oops, I thought this was a longer version of the installation. You know what? I'm going to pop over to my DVD. Sorry. Sorry, you'll get to watch that beginning again. There's a lot more, so I wanted you to see the rest of it.
TextTrain is a playful interactive installation that blurs the boundary between the familiar and the magical. Participants in the TextTrain installation use the familiar instrument of their bodies to do what seems magical, to lift and play with falling letters that do not really exist. Like rain or snow, the colored text appears to land on participants' heads and arms. The text responds to the participants' motions and can be caught, lifted, and then let fall again. The falling text will land on anything darker than a certain threshold and fall whenever that obstacle is removed. If a participant accumulates enough letters along their outstretched arms or along the silhouette of any dark object, they can sometimes catch a word or even a phrase. The falling letters are not random, but form lines of a poem about bodies and language.
So we were talking at lunch about the text that's actually part of this piece, and what is the importance of that? Could I switch it to a Twitter feed or something like that? And Romy and I really thought carefully about what that text was. It's a poem that is about this kind of slippage between, is it really a conversation or is something physical happening between these two people? And I think we still struggle with this issue with all our devices of like sort of where does our body live in all of this? And so that's sort of a key issue that I think I've explored with all of my work. So again, this was 1999, so before OpenCV, like really, really early examples of computer vision kind of installations. It's interesting to think back on that time. Most people were actually, the thing they were most shocked about first when they saw this was the projector, right? So they're like, how do you get that image so big? And then they would be like, how am I in that image? And then they would come to realize like, oh, there's these text, these things I can actually, that can land on my body. So I like to think too, in any kind of interaction design, like what's that sort of ramp in to discovering more and more things? So once they worked out that they could catch the letters, at first that's really exciting. But then there's this whole other layer that, whoa, there's actually some words in there. It's not totally random. But it's really hard to read the whole poem, so I don't think that anyone ever gets that all exactly. But part of it is that there is some meaning that's kind of always just a little bit outside of your grasp, which again is something that's kind of interesting to me as an artist. And then there's the social layer as well. So if you're in the space alone, you can have that kind of interaction, but often, like you saw in the video, when people are there, they find different ways to kind of try to work together or get the letters from somebody else. And there's a few design components of this work that I've been thinking about. I just showed it again in San Jose in a show called Patent Pending, which is all artists who have dealt with the our IP system in some way or another. So partly because of the fact I was employed by Interval and their relationship with NYU decided to patent this while I was there. So I have a patent. Well, NYU owns it. Romy and I are the inventors. But that was an interesting show, looking at artists as engaging with the patent system in different ways. But watching this piece again, it's been shown all over the place, and I don't always go to install it anymore. So watching really young people encounter this for the first time, I'm always wondering, like, is there going to come a point where this kind of interaction becomes not interesting anymore, right? Because now we see this kind of in airports and, for advertising. It's, you can do it with your Connect at home, so does it become a gimmick? And I think there's a way where it has even surprised me kind of how people still find a rich engagement in this work. And I've been trying to analyze that a bit, which is something you all maybe could help me with, since I don't write research papers on the actual interaction design. But I think there's some really simple choices that Romy and I made, maybe intuitively or just by luck, that help with that. One of them is, no matter how many people are in this space, they're not occluding, or they are occluding each other, but even if there's like just this tiny, tiny like fringe at the top where the letters are falling, you can still reach your hands above other people and get them. So just by nature of the fact that there's something falling from the top of the screen, even in a really crowded space, the interaction, everyone can still have the interaction. And it actually gets kind of fun that you can stand behind someone and try to reach above their head to get the letters. So I tried, I've done lots of other kinds of installations using cameras in a silhouette view like that. And you always have this problem that if someone's behind the other person, they're kind of not part of the interaction in some way. So that maybe was just luck based on this idea that we were exploring. The fact that the people are in black and white, and the letters are in color, I think is important. So I think there's this idea in a lot of interactive installation that the more we add, the better it is. The sort of more hyper-realistic it is, the more you feel like you're in the actual environment. But I think there's something very compelling about seeing yourself in black and white, which kind of removes you from reality, and the letters being in color. So there's always this distinction between the thing you're engaging with and your representation of yourself. We often argue with people, I'll go back to my PowerPoint. Not argue, but when we install this piece, let's go back to this one. About, it's pretty hard to get the camera always in the middle of the screen. It means you can't use a screen like this. You have to cut a hole in the wall. And everyone always would prefer, can't you put the camera on top of the screen or below the screen? But there's a really simple reason why that's super critical, which is people's line of sight. right? So if you've ever Skyped and had a camera that wasn't the camera in your laptop, when we used to have the other ones, it could be somewhere else, you realize how totally distracting it gets when you can't look at the other person in the screen and make kind of eye contact with them, which is just an illusion of where the camera is, right? So now, since the camera's right here, when I'm Skyping with someone, it's pretty close to my line of sight, similarly to how here we have it in the middle of the screen. If it was up above, it'd kind of be looking down at you, and you wouldn't like literally be able to look at someone else the way these people are in the screen. So there's this real illusion that you can communicate with a person standing right next to you by looking in this sort of mirror-like space together. Let's see, what else do I want to say? I think that's it for now. I'm sure I'll leave time for questions about this. But again, this idea of what's the role of our body in relation to these systems. And I guess one other thing, my favorite moment in that video is when the little boy turns the umbrella upside down, right? Because he's making a hypothesis about how the system works and is then making his next attempt to test it out, right? If I can catch the letters on the top of the umbrella, what happens if I turn the umbrella upside down? So I think those kind of moments are what really got me hooked on being an interactive artist. So this was really one of the first major pieces I did. And then I just wanted to keep doing it because of creating those kind of spaces for people. I started thinking more about the way we use language in relation to our body. So we often say, like, what's your position on this issue? Where do you stand? Right? And we mean that, like, what are your political views, or what's your scholarly position on this? But I was thinking about that as in a very literal sense, like that stems from a literal position that you may be standing in. And I wanted to create a space that, again, was multi-user. So thinking back again to this time, this idea of a social engagement with a computer was very, very different than it is now. So I wanted to create that kind of space. But I was thinking about, could I make a shared space on the screen that also represented, like, literally having these different viewpoints, so that it wasn't a coherent space in a sort of linear one-point perspective photographic way, right? So computers are really, really good at rendering something, based on this formula that we have a camera over here and these objects here, and we're going to project them onto a flat plane, which is the computer's, then we'll render that, and that'll be the computer screen. But if you look at art history, that kind of way of depicting space is a very small part of our history. And there's lots of artists that have worked with other ways of creating space and representing a reality. So like Picasso and the Cubists, like to position lots of different things together on their painting surfaces. So I was thinking about that. I'll let you watch this, and then I'll explain a little more how I got there. And so the original, this is a series I continued. So what I'm showing you is actually a more recent piece in this series.
Shifting Time, San Jose is an interactive video installation that juxtaposes the past and present using the viewer's body as the interface to navigate between different times. In this piece, commissioned by the city of San Jose for a new terminal of the San Jose International Airport, viewers first encounter a projected still image. As they walk closer to the projection wall, the surface disrupts, revealing deeper moments of time in the pre-recorded video clips. Viewers are able to shift between past and present by moving towards and away from the projection wall. Shifting Time, San Jose continues Utterback's Liquid Time series, which uses her custom software to deconstruct the video frame as the unit of playback. This strategy of fragmentation allows multiple moments to appear simultaneously and speaks to the possibilities of digital tools, as well as the fluidity of our personal memories. Unlike the previous Liquid Time pieces, Shifting Time San Jose extends the period of time depicted from seconds to decades. In this work, high-definition video footage from the present blends with archival film footage from the 1920s through the 1960s. Each of the 20 scenes in Shifting Time San Jose pairs footage of a historic site or activity in the San Jose area with complementary contemporary footage. Some scenes depict recognizable locations in both the past and present. Other scenes show people working at industries long gone, paired with employees in the current high-tech sector. Leisure and travel scenes from past eras are paired with their contemporary counterparts. Different forms of stasis and change are revealed as time shifts subtly within each clip, and more drastically between the different eras of historic time. As the past visually intersperses with the present, Shifting Time San Jose creates an intriguing visual metaphor of how both history and our memories of a place contribute to our experience of the present moment.
So in the end, the piece I developed is still using one-point linear perspective as conveyed by a lens. But that wasn't sort of where I started. That's where the piece ended up. So one thing that's great about being an artist is you can kind of follow the mistakes and take advantage of the things that are happening. So what I first started doing when I was set out to do this is I imagined the space in front of the screen as kind of having maybe 7 or 8 different zones in it. And as you move forward and backward, closer or further away from the screen, you would get whatever type of imagery was in those zones. And I was coding this myself, so I had these lists of the different images that you were kind of moving through as you moved back and forth. And different people could be in like a different layer at a time, because if I was, this person could be there and I could be here. So I liked that idea that you were getting these different perspectives together. And I sort of kept making more and more and more layers, and this list was getting longer and longer. And I had this very aha moment that a list of images in the computer is a video file. Which is sort of obvious, but I think a lot of people don't understand that if you haven't been sort of trying to access one image and print it to the screen and get the next image in the queue. So I decided, hey, what would happen if these layers that you were moving through were kind of infinitely thin, and it was actually each one was a frame of 24 frames per second or whatever video. So that visually was a lot more interesting than my original premise. And in the earlier pieces, like the voiceover said, it would be one clip that you were moving through, so like 10 seconds of time, not like what you just saw where I was pairing up the present 5 seconds or 10 seconds with a really deep past, another 5 or 10 seconds. If you want to think, I think a lot of people have now seen this. It's often called slit scan. I didn't know about that when I was first working on this, but as soon as you start looking at the frame data as digital information, it's very easy to take a slice of that video frame, right? Like when video was film and it was like literally a celluloid square after a celluloid square after a celluloid square, it's really hard to physically take a little stripe of that out and put it next to another one. But once it's in the computer, you can easily get at any pixel. So I think there's a lot of people now kind of experimenting in this way where they're they're looking at that volume of video data as data, not frame by frame by frame. But it's a sort of interesting premise, like just because we recorded this information in one structure, why do we have to play it back using that same structure? And for those of you that aren't really familiar with this, a way to think about it is that if you imagine the video as a flip book that's stapled along the top, like one of those little paper flip books, and then cut a whole bunch of slices in it vertically, then you can flip any of those vertical strips independently of each other. So that's sort of the effect that I'm creating. And I think another important thing, which wasn't obvious to me at the time, but like the more and more popular different computer vision systems become, is that in both TextRain and this, I'm kind of using a really dumb algorithm because I was just learning how to do all this. I don't have any kind of skeleton constructed. In either of these pieces, I don't even have blob detection. Like, I don't even know that this area is a person. I'm really just looking at the contours of your body, right? So in TextRain, the space is set up very specifically so there's a white wall behind you. So even if you're wearing a white shirt, you're darker than the wall, so there's no reference frame for those of you that do computer vision stuff. It's just looking for dark above a certain threshold, which I've set up in this space. And in this piece, it's really doing the same thing, but the camera's on the ceiling looking down. So like your nose is deeper into time than your shoulders. But what I found is there's more and more of these tools that are available. It's actually like we're dumbing down the body, right? So even though we have a very sophisticated model, like what you can get through the Connect API, we know exactly where the joints are and how your hands are moving, a lot of really rich information is thrown out, I think, or it's not actively used as much as it could be. So if you think about in texturing, like how someone's arms, like the letters can really build along their contour, or in this piece, how, like what I just said, your nose is actually deeper than your shoulders, and you get these kind of really interesting undulations. I feel like a lot of that is sort of not being used in a lot of the, not all, but in a lot of the computer vision systems that I see. It's like because we have this other higher level information, we've kind of lost some of what the camera can give us as an input device. So that's something I've been thinking about a little bit lately. I want to point out this circle of light on the floor too. When I first did this piece, I didn't indicate the interaction area at all, and it was kind of a failure because people couldn't understand that they could see all this imagery changing, but it wasn't super obvious to them, especially like at an opening when there was a lot of people around, where the interaction was in the space. Because there's no indication of your body. Unlike texturing, it's really clear when you're in or out of the piece. And so I started experimenting with different ways to indicate that. Some of the failed ones were, like at one gallery, there was a very shiny floor, and I put some sort of thin PVC stuff down, like kind of matte, like doormat kind of stuff. And people started doing this, right? Because you're giving them this indication that that's some sort of sensor on the floor. And so their testing out of this system was giving them completely the wrong clue. So I tried other ways of marking the floor, and in the end, this sort of square of light is something I've used in some of the other pieces I'll show you too, because there's a really nice connection between the projection being light and this light on the floor being the same, indicated not with paint or not with something else that wouldn't confuse people that it was a sensor. But it has sort of the same visual characteristics. So I just wanted to point that out. And in the airport piece, the video, we couldn't get this kind of rectangle because of the height of the ceiling, so we did little corner squares, which would not be not my preference, but this was the piece at the airport again. So just some images. This is one of my favorites. It was really fun to shoot the archival footage, or we looked for we did all the research to find the archival footage, and then we had to figure out what to pair it with. But this one of the women sorting fruit and the women programming, this idea of, again, what's the role of our body in these different forms of work is interesting to me. So the next series I'm going to show you, I won't show you all the pieces, but it's kind of an extended series I've done called External Measures, where I started thinking about, could I make something on the screen that was a drawing system that was algorithmically reacting to people's movement in the space, that both generated something visually interesting and was also interesting for people physically as they interacted in the space, right? So I think if you guys think about other kinds of interactive art that you've seen, there are a lot of projects where the interaction is sort of conceptual, meaning it might be important to the idea of the piece, but it's very hard for you to experience it, right? It's very hard for you to test how it's actually reacting to you, or you have these mistaken cues like I was talking about. So it was really important to me in these that you could, like the little boy turning over the umbrella, slowly test the different parts of the system and how it was reacting to you. So this was the first one. You can see how people are indicated as they're the negative space. So their bodies actually erase what's on the screen. And I'm not going to show a video of this one because it was one of the earlier ones. But there was a network of little gray lines that was always spinning, and whenever it intersected with you, it had to. This I got blob detection working. So you would be assigned a color when you walked into the space, and anything that hit you would turn that color, and then keep going. So there was also this sense that you had influenced this bigger system, but it was doing its own thing independently of you. There's a screenshot of it. And then these are two of the next pieces, Untitled 5 and Untitled 6. And I'm going to show you a video of Untitled 5. And you know what? I'm going to flip back to the DVD because this might be a short one, too. I didn't test these videos. Bad.
Untitled 5 is the fifth interactive installation in the External Measures series, which Utterback has been developing since 2001. The goal of these works is to create an aesthetic system which responds fluidly and intriguingly to physical movement in the exhibit space. In these dynamic works, the positions, velocity, and existence of various parts of a projected image depend on people's presence and movement. Some responses are direct and immediate. Other behaviors evolve over time based on the flow of people in the space. In Untitled 5, a network of gray lines flickers around one's body and immediately indicates your presence. A colored line is drawn along your trajectory. When you leave the installation, this line is filled with tiny marks. These marks can now be pushed from their location by other people's movement. Displaced marks attempt to return to their original location, creating smears and streaks of color as they move. These painterly swaths are the result of intersections between current and previous motion in the space, conceptually linking disparate moments in time. Untitled 5 reacts to stillness as well as motion. Standing in place sets off a delicate spray of dots which radiate from the center of one's body. While one's presence generates marks, it also erases older marks. The rules of Untitled 5 are carefully constructed to create an overall composition that is organic, open, and evocative, while still being completely algorithmic. While the specific rules of the system are never explicitly revealed to participants, the internal structure and composition of the piece can be discovered through a process of kinesthetic exploration. Engaging with this work creates a visceral sense of unfolding or revelation, but also a feeling of immediacy and loss.
That was the floor that didn't work very well. That.
The experience of this work is the experience of embodied existence itself, a continual flow of unique and fleeting moments.
So in this, I was kind of splitting the difference of those two ways of looking at human movement that I was just talking about. So the line that's being drawn, obviously I'm reducing you to a point. It's the center of your blob. But that kind of gray mesh around the outside of your body still has that richness of really the contours of what you look like. And the other thing that I think is still kind of unique about this piece compared to some similar types of installations is that it's not just doing one thing. There's not one rule, right? So in text reading, the rule is really simple. The letters have to land on anything that's darker than the background. But there is a richness both because of the way it's following the contours of your body and the fact that there's text that you can or cannot decipher and the social interactions that develop. But the actual rule of the system is very, very simple. Same with the liquid time piece, right? I described how you're like flipping through these pieces of video, but it's kind of one rule. There's not a lot. There's a little bit of how far you get those strips messed up. They take a little time to return to stillness, but it's really the same rule set. In these, I was really looking at them as a kind of larger composition. Like how could I, as an artist, think of each of these rules as sort of one element in a bigger picture, no pun intended. And how did each of those rules function in the overall experience? So some of them, like the little gray lines, really help you find where you are. The other one tells you something about time passing, right, because the line is building up. And then I think what's most interesting about this piece, and this is the one in the series where I really got to this, was that the things that are happening don't just have to do with you, right? So a lot of our interaction design, it's very sort of like egocentric, and it's all about you and everything you're doing, and you, right? And immediate feedback, you, right? So, but with this system, what the voiceover is trying to describe is that I'm looking at the visual marks that get laid down as a sort of history, but because it's not a paint line that's fixed, it's actually a history that's in code, I can then have the people in the space that come later that have their movement intersect with that past movement. So I don't know if that made sense from the voiceover, but like if I walk in one line through the space, the little marks are holding, their size is based on how fast I was going. And they obviously know the XY position that they got laid down on. If another person walks through, they get pushed away. So there's already one interaction between the past and the present, but they have a rule that they're trying to go back then when the second person gets out of the way to their original location. So the thing that's drawing the most in this piece is that difference between someone that was there in the past where they walked and someone that was there now. So I think, again, this is an area that there's still a lot of space to explore that, of how we can show these connections between different moments in time. And I don't think people ever figure this all out either. So in terms of the interaction design, hopefully what makes these works compelling, there's a lot of collectors that now have them either in lobbies or homes. They're not like a one-liner, right? But they're also not inscrutable. So when you walk into this installation, you can find yourself. Like you can test, oh, there's my arm, I see myself. You can see some things that are very clearly reacting to you and understand why, but there's that layer of connection with the past that's always a little hard to totally decipher, so it doesn't become predictable. And I think those, again, are kind of metaphors of interaction we could stand to think more about. There it is in a lobby. And here, unfortunately, I wasn't able to convince them to do any kind of light on the floor. The ceiling was pretty low. So, and often, here's the problem of being an artist, too. I install these things, and I don't always get a chance to go back and analyze what's happening. So this is a lobby in Hong Kong. I can't really tell you how much people there understand the piece. But the fact that it's a residential lobby and people live there makes me think that eventually they would come to sort of understand where the interaction area is here. And I had a chance to install all 3 of these at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And this was the first time I really started making some conclusions about how the animations that were generated in each work changed people's behaviors. So in the first piece that was always moving, which you didn't see video of, I noticed, this is very anecdotal, so I love an HCI person to analyze this more fully at some point. I found it made people really twitchy. Because every time they walked into the space, they affected the system, they left, it started rewriting over where they were. It's like you don't like this idea that whatever you just inscribed into this piece is vanishing. So people would they were much more like in, out, in, out, in, out. Whereas on Titled 5, which I just showed you, once it comes to stillness, it stays that way, even if it's 3 hours until another person comes into the space. So people would step out and watch the work, and then it was almost like the opposite. If you stepped into the interaction area, you were making a state change from it being still and really beautiful to who knows if you're going to mess it up or you're activating it again. So there was almost, I wouldn't say a hesitation because people would get really excited, but it felt very different to step into that piece than into the piece on the left, even though sort of ostensibly they're just all these drawing systems. So I think there could be some interesting research in there. I'm going to go a little faster through some of these bigger pieces, which is mainly what I've been doing for the past, I guess, 6 or 7 years. This is 2007 on the San Jose City Hall. So I had a chance to put a camera up in the dome and watch the whole plaza. A lot of things didn't work well scaled up. So luckily it was a temporary installation, but I got to change it every night. So the pictures of it look really different. I was trying to figure out also, because this surface is so complicated, like how to help people see themselves in some of those ways I was talking about before. So I had to get sort of more and more obvious and more bold for people to see. And I started trying to do things like have certain behaviors when a group would form, which were sort of moderately successful. There's me testing one program and running another one, and then I would swap things over the next day if I liked what I had been doing. So there's 2 parallel machines there, each with the same camera input. Originally, I wanted to scrim this surface to make a nice, clean surface. You learn a lot of interesting things working with public spaces. That was not allowed on the City Hall because it would have set a precedent for hanging banners on the City Hall. So I had to work with the surface that was there, which in the end turned out to be really kind of beautiful. How the light was hitting all these, the front layer and this back layer. So that idea comes back in the last piece I'll show you. This is a piece called Aurora Organ. Sorry, that piece was called Abundance. This is Aurora Organ from 2009. It's in a movie theater, like the lobby of a movie theater in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. It's right outside of Minneapolis. I'm going to talk a tiny bit about the space as part of the interaction design. So this piece, I'll show you a video clip of it in a second, but there's capacitance sensors along the hand railing, and how people touch that affects the patterns in the hanging lights. But the original spec that I was asked to submit a proposal for was to create a video piece, an interactive video piece like what you've been seeing on this wall here. There's a lot of problems with that. Number one, it's this huge glass atrium, right? I was like, yeah, this is, the budget is not big enough to have the projector power to cover that. But I also didn't think that from the way that people would walk through this space made a lot of sense, right? They talked about the stakeholders here talked about wanting to create a social interaction and a sense of drama in the space. And I thought, well, the people are coming into this space through these stairs, coming up these escalators. And if you want to create a social interaction, don't you want to focus people around that, like not have them be standing looking at this other wall? So my proposal was to activate the hand railing as the site of the interaction, again, to focus people in, not have them all be looking up at this other wall. And I said if the output of this interaction is physical, even if there are times of the day where the LEDs are also going to be struggling against the sun, it has a presence, it's not just gone. So it activates the space visually even when it's not totally visible. So here's a little clip of it. I think. Well, let's go back to the DVD. DVD to the rescue.
Aurora Organ is a contemporary meditation on the possibilities of translating human presence into light using digital technology. Commissioned by Forecast Public Art and Duke Realty for the City of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, this site-specific interactive sculpture is installed in the 80-foot atrium of the Showplace Theaters, located at the Shops at West End in St. Louis Park. The piece combines custom software, RGB LEDs, touch sensors, and traditional sculptural materials to create an intriguing experience for theatergoers. As people touch or tap the hand railing around the building's stairwell, these intimate gestures are amplified into architectural scale patterns of light. In the Aurora Organ sculpture, 6 light columns hang at various elevations above the theater entrance. On the second floor landing, 6 illuminated glass sensors are inset in the wooden hand railing and cycle through a palette of colors, beckoning viewers to approach. Each time a person taps or touches a railing sensor, a pulse of the current railing color is added to the corresponding column. The length of each pulse depends on the length of time a person touches the railing. Holding the railing sensor creates a long streak of color, while tapping creates shorter bursts. New colors overlay and blend with previous patterns in the columns, creating a record of past and present activity at the railings. Each column of Aurora Organ becomes a temporal history and amplified visual trace of people's presence and activity in the atrium. The colors of light in each column move about in various ways, going faster or slower, traveling up or down, depending on how people tap or touch the railing. If 2 or more participants hold down their sensors, completely filling their columns with color, the colors start jumping from column to column. If people around the stairwell cooperate, touching all 6 sensors simultaneously, general properties of the system, like gravity, are reversed, causing a major change in the behavior of all the colored elements. Further hidden behaviors are revealed the more people engage with the sculpture. While the patterns created by people's actions in Aurora Organ are ultimately transient, the bursts of light created by the most recent participants continue to cycle in the columns even after these people have gone. Left alone, Aurora Organ echoes these patterns in the empty lobby, dreaming of the touches of people who are no longer there.
So the more and more sort of actual public space we lose, right? Like this is a private movie theater. I've been trying to consider ways where within that structure people can feel connected to those spaces. It doesn't solve the political issues of those public spaces turning more and more private, but the idea, similarly to the city hall, where you can sort of put something of not just your tweet feed or Twitter feed or not just your thoughts, but something of your physicality. You can't add color to this piece unless you actually touch the hand railing, right? It's literally a record of that physical interaction. So I want to show you. We go till 2. Is that right? Yeah. I'll give me 5 minutes and then we'll have 15 minutes. 2 or 5. Okay, cool. I want to talk a little about the sensor design, the capacitance sensors in these hand railings. there's the piece again, which I worked with a great engineer and a team of people on this whole project. So all these projects are starting to scale up in terms of the team. But figuring out how to do something that felt nice. I wanted to do sandblasting, but that collects a lot of oil from your hands. The sandblasting, we needed to diffuse the light so you didn't see the LEDs in there. So we worked really hard on these combinations of materials, also finding the capacitance sensor to be clear so the light could go through it, how to hook them all together. How to get the wiring through this hand railing and still have it pass code. So it has to still allow an impact of a 250-pound person running at a certain speed with a safety factor of 5, which was pissed off my engineer who was used to medical devices, which safety factor of 5 for that kind of thing was not what he was used to. But we figured it all out. A thing I'm particularly proud of is that there are these units you can take out. So if we ever have a maintenance problem, we actually made and stained at the same time as the hand railing pieces of wood you can put back in and screw back in, and these just plug out so they could send them back to us to get fixed, which actually luckily hasn't happened yet. But in public art, thinking about that, this is Ian Smith-Heisers who did the programming, the DMX programming for the LEDs. And this is my favorite part. So we weren't allowed to modify these, the vertical pieces of the hand railing. So the question was how to get the cabling down into the floor, which all that guts had to exist somewhere in the floor. And so if you look at this, it's a secret collar that hides that, which I thought was really great because you really don't notice it at all. But it allowed us, we were allowed to drill a hole into the larger pipe part, but we weren't allowed to modify the actual connection point because that had already been rated. The engineering on that had already been done, and we weren't allowed to change it. That's Brett, the engineer I worked with, and Alan, who also helped us. We did a lot of prototyping of the columns to figure out what would be the best. This was a brilliant move on my part, I must say. There's those things you're like, that was the smartest thing I did on this whole project, which was to hang pool noodles first, because the columns are actually kind of delicate, and you're up on a 70-foot lift, hooking them on. We'd done lots of CAD models and a physical model of what we thought the heights would be, but I wasn't sure, right? The physical world is really different than a CAD model. And so we actually did make a lot of changes on site with the pool noodles before we hung the actual thing. So we got the heights all locked in. But people were really funny. They thought that was the artwork for a while. What is this? We don't understand this contemporary art. I think that's all I want to say about that. I want to skip ahead and show you, I want to show you 2 other projects. Very quickly. This was a piece I did for, it was the 75th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. So it was a temporary show in Fort Point, which is the Civil War era fort that's under the bridge. I had this space here, which is one of the old batteries that is literally like where the bridge comes over the space. So kind of following on this idea, I was talking about the hand railing, like how do you focus people's attention through your design on where they actually are and how they engage with other people in this space. I wanted people to think about the fact that they're right under the bridge going across here, and also think about the history of the piece of land that they were standing on, which I thought, I had this great idea that the shores of the San Francisco Bay changed so much over time that I wanted to visualize that somehow. The reason the bridge is built where it is because those are the most unchanging, the most solid rock part of the bay, which is like obvious once I thought about it. So it turned out that there wasn't a lot of change in those areas of the shore. But so the idea is to have monitors in this space and that are like pieces of a map of that shoreline that have the bridge in the map matches the bridge that's going right over your head there. So there you see the monitors with that. And there's the foot of the bridge. So the bridge you're looking at in the maps is like really right out the window. And those are the pieces of the maps I pulled. And so what I did was I was inspired by these Fisk maps of the Mississippi, which show how the Mississippi has changed geologically its path over time. And I wanted to show that kind of deep geological time in the maps that I was, in some interface I was building for these maps. So what I ended up doing, I'll play this, was finding 20 different maps in the Berkeley Map Archive. And again, I thought I was going to see the shoreline change. The shoreline doesn't really change at all. What changes is how we depict it. So this piece really became, for me, about showing our changing technologies of printing, our changing technologies of cartography, and sort of blurring them together, having them burble up in between each other, right? So you don't just see each map one by one by one. So this piece has a lot of relationship to the liquid time piece I showed you, where it's pulling algorithmically in the sort of wavering shape of the shoreline from all these different maps. So Stuart Carter and I were having this conversation at lunch about, this is a kind of, I don't know if this is even an information visualization. And the water comes in every once in a while and washes it all away. Thinking again about our span of time versus this geological span of time. But I do think it gives us a different way to think about this kind of imagery and what's our relationship to that shoreline. And I'm just going to show you, let's see, I have 1 minute. I'm going to go 3 minutes more because I want to show you what I'm currently working on, which are glass projects. So partly from Abundance, which was that projection onto the City Hall, partly because projection, when it's sunny out, you don't really see it. Working on longer term commissions, people are very wary of spending a lot of money on technology that they don't know. I can't guarantee these pieces are going to run in 30 years, right? I think it's probably unrealistic. So I've been trying to think about how do I make these hybrids that could have a physical component and a digital component. So I started working with a glass company in Munich to develop this piece, which I will show a quick video of. These were testing acetate patterns that I then will project onto, which you'll see in the video. And as I was experimenting, I worked out that having 2 layers of glass really gives you a sense of depth. So we literally projection mapped the imagery onto the first layer, the back layer, and the back wall. Where's the video? It's working with the fabricators. We tested, all the colors and everything. And here's the piece. So I just finished this fall. And this is the last thing I'll show you.
Flourish is a 70-foot-long, site-specific installation commissioned for a major thoroughfare in a corporate headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts. The work combines Utterback's interactive installation techniques with a new display method, projection onto multiple layers of custom glass. Utterback created the interactive content for Flourish with animator and frequent collaborator Michelle Higa-Fox. Flourish consists of 7 distinct panels. A triptych, seen from a connecting glass walkway, and a set of 4 panels along the extended thoroughfare. 3 of the panels in the hallway are interactive. The glass panels in Flourish contain hand-painted areas of iridescent, opaque, and translucent glazing, along with intricate sandblasted details. Each panel functions as a static work of art, but at certain times of day, a new dimension is revealed through the interactive projections. The double layers of glass in each panel give the projected light actual physical depth.
They're about 1 inch
Projected
apart.
elements can land on opaque glass in the front panel, back panel, or travel all the way through to the background wall. The varied surface of each panel allows projected light to reflect off the opaque areas, combine with the glazing colors, and cast focused shadows behind the intricate sandblasting. The complex effects of the projected light hitting different surfaces and depths in the glass creates a mysterious viewing experience, where viewers must decipher what is static and what is changing. As viewers walk by the interactive panels, their movements are tracked by overhead video cameras. Projected elements that correspond to the glass designs react to viewers' presence. Dynamic swaths of color and swirls of particles trace viewers' movements along the hall.
So I'm just going to mute the audio and talk over it now. So what's really interesting is being in this space, and people have no idea what they're looking at. Like, people walk through and be like, what is, like, where, what, how, because the depth, even of these 2-inch differences between the wall and the different layers of glass, is not something we're used to seeing. We have screens everywhere, but they're totally 2-dimensional. Any depth rendered on those screens, unless you're using 3D glasses, is an illusion that we've worked out. with linear perspective or other kinds of occlusion and visual tricks on those screens. So this is a new direction I'm going in. I've also been experimenting a bunch with transparent LCD screens and creating interaction through the screen. So, our screens generally, when we're looking at our screen, we might be texting or chatting with someone who's not there, so it's social, but again, your body is kind of gone from that interaction. They take us often away from the people that are standing right around us. So I think there's a lot of potential with the transparent LCDs to create interactions where you're looking at each other through these surfaces, or again, these that are just really using the richness of your body in our actual depth perception. So that's some of the work I'm going to be working on here. I'm also working with Mark Froninger Dance Company, which is a ballet company, on doing some camera tracking for a performance he's doing this fall on Debussy. So if anyone is interested in that, I'm definitely looking for people to work with me on that. And Wendy reminded me I should mention I'm teaching. I'm mainly, a lot of the courses I'm doing this quarter and ongoing are with the graduate design students, but some of the ones that are open to everyone, the one I'm doing this spring is called Time Shift. So we're looking at ideas of time and how artists sometimes are maybe ahead of culture in terms of visualizing new ways of thinking about time, or sometimes helping us understand, how our technologies change how we think about time. So it's pretty fun. It's a studio class, though, so you're actually making things around these themes. So we have 10 minutes for questions. No, 15 minutes for questions. Great.
How you kind of evaluate your own work? By that, what I mean is, some people might interact with your piece by just being entertained and playing around with it for a few minutes and then move on, or some people maybe may spend a longer time trying to really understand what's happening and maybe get all the way to the theme that you have in mind when you're designing the piece. And so I'm just kind of curious, do you have some sort of reaction of the people in mind when you design a piece, or are you how do you know, okay, like this worked out, this didn't work out, I'm just curious how you evaluate that.
I guess, art how you evaluate it is obviously very different than like a functional interface where there's a specific task that is a goal. I think I alluded to it a little when I was talking about does something kind of endure, right? Like what I'm hoping to do is make pieces of art, like the paintings that we treasure in museums that people want to keep looking at, years and years and different times in your life, or like you can sit in front of it for a long time, like that there's something about it that is rich enough that you don't just look at it and want to get sick of it and throw it out, and never see it again. So it's that kind of idea of like, is it disposable, or is there something enough that when you go back or walk through this hallway? I mean, the last piece I just showed you is it's a corporate hallway, so people go by there every day. So do they stop looking at it, or is there something about it that's going to continue to hold their attention? I don't think, again, because it's an artwork that, sometimes people walk through the hallway and they're busy and they're talking to someone, so they're not there. You're going to have a very more peripheral interaction with it, and other times they might spend more time with it. So it's more about that span of deeper time than any specific interaction. In fact, that was something I talked about in the late 90s, early 2000s with the pieces like Text Rain and Liquid Time, that the metaphor of interaction at that time was really more like a book or a movie, like you would sit down at the computer and interact with it. And I talked about those pieces as being ambiently interactive, meaning you can still be having conversation, you can be doing something else while you're interacting with them, which is sort of now, because of our devices are so small and we're always doing that, it's almost like the opposite problem. Now it's like, how do we have attention to anything because we're so distracted? But I think there's a way where it's okay that you can scale. We do that with music. You kind of have it in the background, or you really listen to it sometimes. So I think allowing people to determine how they want to interact with it is okay, as long as it doesn't get boring. That was a long answer.
You've used technologies like you mentioned video, the touch screens, like the way you did the projection, kind of mapping, to keep people like right on the edge of what they're used to seeing, so that they kind of look at it a different way. So like, I guess right now, what would be like the technologies that you think that would be interesting to work with to like now keep people on the edge of what they're used to seeing?
I just did a proposal for these transparent LCDs. Which is something I'm really interested in. Also flexible screens, again, because I think that kind of shatters this idea of of screens being windows, these rectangular things that we're always looking through. It's, like there's so much more we could be thinking about in that, but we've sort of been limited by what's commercially available. So I'm hoping, maybe with the research I'm doing here to make some prototypes that would help open new possibilities for that. I didn't show a bunch of pieces I did with other kinds of sensors. They're on my website. The potent objects are like accelerometers in snow globes with video screens in them that, now again, like iPhones have accelerometers, so that seems kind of normal, but that was when I did those, it was sort of before that. So I don't even know if it's that I want to use these kind of early, like bleeding edge technologies because they're things people haven't seen. It's just that I'm curious about that. Like I really like combining, yeah.
The fact that people are the projector, I'm not used to seeing myself in that kind of setting, and they weren't at that point.
Right. But so then the question is, going back to the question right before yours, is it still interesting now? And I was saying that show I was just at, the answer was really yes. I think because of some of the actual things in the piece that are happening. Some I didn't even, like the letters are also always fading too, so it does have this sense that like you can't ever quite, it's not a kind of perfect interaction, but that's a little bit more interesting. So, but yeah, I'm really interested in the sculptural possibilities of screens and things that use our depth perception, which it's part of this whole idea that how does this stuff like limit our body and what we're really good at, or how does it really respond to it? And so I'm hoping that that's a new kind of area of hope that we can not, I'm starting, my eyes hurt sometimes now when I look at the screen so much. So it's like, that's because you're looking at this light bulb, flat light bulb, so like e-ink surfaces and things like that is something I think I'll be working with a bunch. And just to critique myself, I feel like the interaction in the piece I just showed you is a little dumbed down. Maybe that's strong, but part of it is that that's not a place people are going to stand and hang out in that hallway. So there is a sense that reacting to this quick movement back and forth is appropriate maybe for that space. But it was also just a matter of time allocation on that project. I really wanted to work on that depth and getting that richness in there, and the interaction design maybe suffered a bit from that. I'll take over.
How much do things like you learn during your prototyping process influence the interaction design? Like, do you just start with the vision and the prototyping is just to see whether it's buildable, or do you actually go through the whole iterative design and prototyping evaluation process?
I try to do as much as I can. Sometimes again, just because of the time frame, I don't get to do as much. In the Aurora Organ piece, which is the LED piece, I made a big mistake because of how I was prototyping in my studio, which you may remember. There was one image with the orange columns. My space is 20 feet tall. The columns are 17 feet tall. So they were hanging, a foot off the ground and a foot and a half and a foot and a half or something. And so anytime we were looking at the bottom of the column, when we were testing the touch sensor, we could see our hands on the sensor and the bottom of the column. So there was a line of sight. So it was really clear that when I was touching this, orange, 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 you could make that connection, and the people that we had in could make that connection. In the space, we hung the columns up there. So you're doing this, and the reaction is up there. You can no longer see the railing sensor. And so people weren't figuring it out at all, because you'd be touching this or tapping or something, and it's changing colors. And so whichever color it is the color that gets added. So you can kind of choose what color, but not if you can't look. You gotta be doing like that. So we changed that so that the bottom of the columns, I don't know if you remember, but now they flash white, and they have this color that matches the hand railing. So there's a parallel to the sensor and the railing in the bottom of each column, so you can very clearly see, oh, white, 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 even though you're not looking at your hand. So that just blinds. That was just something I didn't think about, that how high that distance would change things. So sometimes even your best attempts, you need to adjust something on site.
From what you've said, it seems that through your work, you've almost preempted things that have been added into social or technological devices. For example, we talked about the accelerometer that you worked with before. It was in the iPhone, or motion sensors before they connect. Now you're talking about curved screens, right? And we see that coming in with the Samsung phone. So it seems that this experimentative artwork, or this interactive art that you're doing, is very much tied to social or technology, right? So I wanted to hear you comment on where do you think that overlap is and how experimentative art would influence things like wearable technology.
That's great. Yeah, so there's big areas that I'm not really working in. I think that's sort of data space too, right? Like people, again, we alluded to it before, people are asking like, what if you take some data feed of like Twitter or like other kind of information? People call me a lot and say, can you make an installation with like data about our company or whatever? So I think those are really interesting areas. It's just, I am like interested in you in, this immediate physical presence. So, so just as an aside, those are sort of areas I'm not looking at. Wait, what was the question? How am I?
Interaction with people with technology. It seems like this really is like where you work, right? And it's becoming more like intrinsic in our lives, especially with this boom in wearable technology. So where do you think that your work would influence positively wearable technology?
I mean, I think Eric Palos, who's at Berkeley, has this amazing slide lecture where he shows a lot of things like Google Maps. Michael Neymark did a thing called Aspen Movie Map, 10 or 15 years before that, which was effectively Google Maps. Even Twitter was basically the people that started that, acknowledged it was based on an artist project around the World Economic Forum, where they wanted people to be able to quickly communicate about where they were gathering, to protest and stuff. So I think if we really know our history, that artists are often, opening up these weird spaces that are not, because we have a lot more freedom than like a corporation to take risk, to sort of question things. It's a bit structural. It's like, well, that's what we do, and that's what we try to learn how to do. So I think I don't know if that's particular to me. I mean, obviously I'm engaging with technology, so there's some artists that still are working in traditional media, but I think if you're thinking about what you would like to see differently in our society and trying to make examples that show some possibility there, that ultimately those, hopefully, I mean, I do hope that those get incorporated into like what happens, because, I didn't want a world where we only just sat in front of our computers all the time. And I still don't want a world where we're just like face planted into our screens all the time. So I think, again, in this proposal for the transparent screens, when I was talking with Michelle, who I'm going to collaborate with again, I think the idea of like distributed screens, where each pixel or part of the screen isn't in an XY grid, and that they could each like be Wi-Fi communicate. Right now you take the screen buffer and you send it out, mostly in commercial devices anyway, to an XY grid, and even if that grid's going to curve, there's a certain structure to that information. What if every pixel was anywhere and it had like an IP address or something? I mean, that might not be the best way to organize it, right? But like, then the screen could come apart and come back together. It's not a flat thing that even has to have a rectangle anymore. Like and maybe if they know the relationship between each other, how information is mapped to that can change. So I think we're really still like daguerreotypes to photography in terms of how we have digital information overlaid on our physical world, and that could mean like in fabrics or other things, or in our bodies. That gets kind of creepy, but there's a lot of artists like experimenting with like embedded, cyborgy type things. Google Glass is getting a little close to that, right? So what does that mean for us as humans? Good things to think about.
Seems like you think a lot about the fluidity of time, and as an artist, you said you want something that's lasting, that's permanent.
Mm-hmm. Well, not permanent, but that isn't a one-liner.
So how do you, given that technology is so ephemeral, but at the same time you want to make a lasting contribution to art, how do you see that, especially given that technology is moving faster and faster?
Yeah, I do talk, so there's a conflict in that, which maybe, this move towards working with glass, I'm thinking about, I'm not so interested that my art is going to be here in 30 years. It's just, while it's around, I want it to be interesting, right? So I do really look at a lot of this stuff as sort of extended performance art. It's a transient form, ultimately, the technology. So I'm pretty comfortable with that. The alternative is to work in bronze or oil paint, but I don't think that brings up these questions that the other person just asked of like, what is our relationship to all this stuff? So I want to be doing that, and therefore I'm making fairly transient things, but I'd like them to be interesting while they can still function and not be disposable in that sense. The environmental issue of, all this crap that we're putting out is something I'm starting to think more about, but I'm not quite sure. I want to play with this stuff, so I don't know how we look at the, piles of CRT screens and LCD screens, like just the huge amounts of garbage we're creating. Like that's another question worth thinking about. You asked.
I think Camille will actually be around for
Yeah,
after.
I have an hour after now to talk if anyone's like, thank you guys. And I'm here, so don't be a stranger if you have ideas or want to collaborate or something.